Oh, hello.
Hello, internets.
Hi, hot goss.
Oh,
What was the thing you wanted to
hot
call
goslings. That's a new little thing we're trying out there.
them? Yeah.
I like it.
We're gonna let you do that.
Hashtag hot goslings. I don't know. I don't hate it.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm into it.
That's a new graphic design challenge for us. Just kidding me.
If anyone can do it,
Ducks.
it's tiny gosling.
Tagline gosling.
That is a hot gosling. We got it. Okay, so hot goslings. This is episode 7.
Okay. Thanks for being with us for 7 episodes so far.
7 episodes, and we're talking about Netflix
And consent.
But in all seriousness, it's the end of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and we've been doing a lot of work this month on raising awareness about sexual assault and sexual violence. So we wanted to do something a little different, but also a little bit the same in our Hot Goss episode, where we bring some awareness to how TV and movies talk about sexual assault and consent. We want to sort of right on the heels of last time's episode that people really loved about problematic faves, and talk a little bit more about how we can be better and smarter TV watchers, and ask better questions, and look at the different messages that we're getting about the relationships that we see in movies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to quickly point out before we get too far into this that we are going to be speaking a little bit about sexual violence. We're going to try to keep it PG, or at the very worst PG-13. If that's not your jam today or in this moment, feel free to tap out, check Instagram, come back and check out the end, because it's going to be pretty awesome.
Yeah.
But we just want to give you that information up front.
Thank you, Shane, for that. I appreciate
Totally.
it. So, Oronde, question for you. Why are we even having this conversation in the first place?
Well, whether we like it or not, the media that we create and consume is really important, right? It does a really special and wonderful job of showing the world not only as it is, but as we want it to be. And I think so for all of us, and especially for young people, like teens and kids that are still trying to formulate their opinions on the world and try to figure out how things work, it's going to be really, really important to make sure that we're showing things, like showing the world as it is and showing the world in a responsible way. And so on that tip, representation matters, right? And so we need to make sure that we're showing people and showing the world in the way that it actually plays out in the real world. So, for example, like Black Panther and Wrinkle in Time are really important to people right now, because it's so rare that you really look at a movie and see a lot of diversity in the way that it is in the world. I know me growing up, like I knew that you didn't really see Black people or anything, but as a grown man sitting and watching Black Panther, I was like amazed and realized that was the first time I ever really watched like a major motion picture and wasn't like embarrassed because like everyone's like a criminal or a thug, or like didn't just like have to shrug it off and say like, oh, I guess I don't exist here.
Yeah.
So as the world's starting to have more of these conversations and starting to like bring up these things that we weren't talking about, it's really important to remember representation in that.
Yeah.
Totally. And sexual violence and how we talk about sexual violence is constantly changing in our society right now. And some of the media that we create is commentary on that, that how this conversation is constantly shifting and changing. And especially as this month comes to a close, I think we want to be more aware of what we're seeing and what media is being created, and then what we're watching and what we're learning. Like, shouldn't we want the conversation in movies about sex and consent to kind of reflect what's happening, or to empathize with survivors and advocate consent?
So then how do we do that? How do we become better, more aware consumers? What are some tools?
That's a great question. I think first and foremost, it's asking questions. It's learning how to ask questions and not taking what we see at face value.
Oh, and so what kind of questions would you then ask?
Well, I think like one of the big questions that I always ask myself is this piece of media that I'm consuming, does it reflect affirmative consent? And if it's not reflecting affirmative consent, what's the reason, right? Like, is there something they're trying to show us? Is this an intentional lack of representation of affirmative consent?
And so can you think of any like examples that you've come across recently
Oh,
where you're like, oh, this?
Oh, boy.
Yes.
So for this example, we're going to take a trip. We're going to go to the exotic and beautiful lands of New Jersey, the Jersey Shores specifically. If you have not seen Jersey Shore,
if you're from New Jersey, I'm so sorry.
If you haven't seen Jersey Shore, like, you're probably just as well. But anyway, the show is basically about partying on the Jersey Shore. And there's this character or person on it, Vinny, who is kind of widely accepted to be like the nice guy of the show. But
by comparison, he is a nice guy.
And he does this thing where, like, towards the end of the night, towards like bar, like last call, he'll kind of like creep around. And he's like staying relatively sober, but like hanging out, just like, and kind of like swooping in and taking the drunk girls. And like, even if people their friends or roommates bring people home.
Yeah.
He's like still like kind of sober and like kind of swoops in as everyone's pairing off and grabs like the drunk girl on her own. And you have to ask yourself, like, is that nice guy behavior? Like, that doesn't feel like a very good thing to be doing and showing. And then the question comes, why are they showing this, right? Are they saying this is something in the world that happens and we're reflecting that? Are they trying to challenge the Vinny as a nice guy thing? Are they trying to make us question like drunkenness and intoxication and consent? Or is it just, exploitation, right? That they like think it's like funny and sexy to like show this type of thing.
Yeah, I think those are all great questions. Yeah. And I don't think the creators of Jersey Shore are thinking that hard.
I don't know if we trust them.
But like, going back to our earlier point, like how do we view and internalize that?
Yeah.
I was just watching Forgetting Sarah Marshall, one of my favorite movies.
A Journey Back to the Past.
It's so good. But there's a scene where two of the main characters are hooking up, and the male character is like, he's like, are you too drunk for this? And she was essentially like, quit being such a wimp, and then like tackles him. And it's a very interesting commentary on like masculinity and how, asking for consent emasculates you, and that she became this like sexual prowess, had this sexual prowess, became this, I don't want to say predator, but he was trying to check in, and instead his like courtesy and getting consent is like thrown back on his face as a weakness.
Right. And like that becomes a joke. Like
it's not a healthy message to be sending to these young people. And I think that's a really good jumping off point to talk about like the concept of punching up versus punching down. And I think that with that, it's like the concept that when there's an imbalance of power. So for example, with like race relations or gender relations or like any of those types of things, like ability, it's rarely, if ever, appropriate to punch down. It's like the people that are already at a loss for power, like we don't make fun of them because it just helps to perpetuate harmful things. You really want to punch up, and so the people that already have the power, it's probably okay to make fun of them. And that's the reason why like a race joke in one movie might not be funny, but in another movie, is totally okay.
Yeah, like the forgetting. Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, isn't that what the situation was, right? Like this cis white dude is like now the butt of this joke.
Right. And like normally he has power, but like all of a sudden the joke doesn't become at the expense of him. It's at the expense of people who ask for consent. And like that's where
good catch.
It's punching down.
Yeah.
And like I think totally that's why that example is so complicated and difficult,
Yeah, totally fair.
Yeah. All right. So let's focus a little bit more on depictions of sexual violence on screen. Like, we could literally host an entire episode about all of the different ways that movies have failed at doing it well. But what are some questions that you ask yourselves when you see sexual violence depicted in a movie?
I mean, I think the biggest one for me is like, is it okay to portray sexual assault on camera? Like, is portraying it endorsing it? Is it normalizing it?
Right. Like, how do we figure out if it's okay? What questions do you ask around it?
Well, I think for me, it's a question of like whether or not this is a useful display, right? And by that I mean like, is this something that's going to help me further understand this character and going to further the narrative and is helping to paint or portray like a full human being, or is this just like a trope, right? Like, are they just like using this to be like titillating and edgy and sexy, and like that doesn't feel good.
Yeah. You brought up a really good example of like revenge plots.
Oh yeah. So like I don't know if anyone's seen Revenge, but if you haven't, you should. It's wonderful. It's just a soap opera.
What is it, ABC?
Yeah, it's an ABC show. And so frequently in one of the tropes used in like popular media in general is if a female character is behaving badly, she's like evil or whatever, there's usually like rape or some sort of like assault in her backstory.
Makes her vengeful.
Yeah. And it's like,
but for male characters, it's frequently something that happened to their family when they were young. It's like, oh, you killed my father, and I must avenge his death. And revenge is really great because like they take the usual trope of like this woman wanting revenge and kind of behaving badly, but it's entirely for that male reason. That is because like someone hurt her father, and so she decided to like systematically destroy a family.
Right. It doesn't mean that like you can't portray characters that have sexual violence in their history. To me, it just says that like you need to do that in a way that like empathizes with them and like doesn't like make them just what happened to them.
Yeah. So the way we were saying it before is that like you need to make sure that you're having a character that is not severe rape. It's a character that is like has experienced rape and is still like a full, complex human being, and like those are different things.
Well, I think thinking about like the male trope of like something bad happened to my family, so I must avenge.
Mhm.
Like he becomes the defender,
Right.
like the defender for the defenseless.
Yeah.
But like, let these women defend themselves.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and the line between like venge and revenge and like defending someone and like trying to right wrongs, and how that even that is drawn along gendered lines.
Right. And so these depictions of sexual violence like are so gendered, and like you can't remove that from the conversation. You have to look at it really critically.
Well, we could also do a whole thing about like how male survivors are portrayed in TV, and like all men must want to have sex, and so like any sex they get is good sex. But we could do a whole series.
We were just talking about that.
Maybe we will.
While we were planning on like how do TV and movies like paint the perfect survivor? Like it's like they have to be pretty and thin and white and young and female, and like I mean like every and cisgendered, right? Like every SVU victim is always like fits that like description, and like that's not the reality, and it's not fair. I mean, representation, as you said, matters. I also think about when I'm thinking about like depictions in movies, like do the creators understand the underlying causes of sexual violence, and are they showing that to me like in what they're showing me on screen?
Yeah.
Thinking about like The Handmaid's Tale.
Love.
Yeah. Which is a great show, and it basically is all about like state-sanctioned sexual violence.
I'm not apologizing for a spoiler alert. If you haven't seen it, that's not on us.
Yeah, I mean, and like when you do, if you do decide to see it, like take care of yourself while you do it. Like it's a hard show to watch, but I feel confident, at least for the most part, that they sort of understand the dynamics of power and control that go into sexual violence. I think a lot about.
Can you give an example?
I think a lot about. So Elizabeth Moss's character has this sort of like flirtatious relationship with one of the servants in the household that she lives in.
Who is a dude.
Who's a dude. And it's sort of like this, like, will they or won't they, kind of, there's this tension building. And then all of a sudden later in the season, spoiler alert, she gets sort of blackmailed into being made to have sex with him. And all of a sudden it like becomes this thing that was like a little bit exciting and titillating, even though she is a survivor of sexual assault, like has this story past, like she was really interested in moving forward in this relationship with him, maybe. All of a sudden she's not, because all of her choices are taken away. Like she's not autonomous anymore. And it tells a really complicated story about consent.
Didn't they, I could be misremembering, didn't they have consensual sex?
And then later,
and the way that it was shot was really incredible, because they, like, the consensual sex was beautiful and they were both enjoying it, and it was,
she like gets on top.
Yeah, it was like fun to watch. And then you can see in both of their faces, and it's written and portrayed and shot really well, that you can tell that even though they're the same two people engaging like arguably in the same act, that is very, very different when the power dynamic changes.
Right. And it was like heartbreaking and beautiful. It tells a really complicated story about sexuality, and in a way that I think, going back to some of our earlier points, like sort of centers the complexity of a survivor story in like a really interesting way.
Totally.
Which I think brings us back to our original point about like portraying consent.
Good sex. Yeah,
good sex. Yeah.
Super hard to find examples of that. Yeah, wicked hard. The first one I think of is actually Grace and Frankie. Not necessarily in terms of getting consent, but they do a whole, again, not sorry about the spoilers. There's a whole season where Grace and Frankie start a vibrator company for older women. And it talks about female sexuality and female pleasure in a way that like gives them some ownership and some autonomy. And so it's like a hugely positive sexual relationship that just happens to be with themselves.
Right. Like they consent to do it.
Rad.
To themselves. I love that.
Yeah.
No, I love that. Can you think of any other examples, Oronde, that you have that like inspire you to ask good questions and then like answer the questions for you?
So like healthy relationships?
Yeah.
Cool. It is literally a children's show. And so the Steven Universe. I think that Steven Universe is this cartoon that I love dearly. It's probably one of my favorite shows.
Yeah.
And part of why it's one of my favorite shows is that just as background to the show, the crystal gems are the main characters of the show. They're basically these like alien superheroes that each have these gemstones. These gemstones encapsulate these like powers for them. And so the crystal gems can do this thing called fusion. And so two or more gems can fuse if they do this like special dance.
Well done.
Yeah, that's
well
unique
done,
to them. And so, for example, like me and Shane's dance would be different than me and Catherine's dance.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, which is really interesting. And so they do this like special dance that's fusion. But it doesn't work under a number of circumstances, right? And so like if like if our dance is out of sync, then it won't work. If one of us doesn't really want to do it, it won't work. And there's sometimes that like it does work, and like you get them to fuse into like this one physical being with shared powers. But it'll be an unstable fusion is what they call it. And it kind of like falls towards chaos. And usually frequently ends up hurting the people involved or the people around them. And it'll oftentimes literally fall apart. They'll fall back out to like their little individual components. And they have this wonderful storyline at one point where one character gets kind of tricked into fusing. And they talk about all the fallout of that. It lasts a few episodes. Yeah. Wow. And they talk about like, cool. what fusing meant for that one character and like why that hurt so badly that they got tricked into it. And so I think it's this like wonderful and surprisingly age-appropriate way of talking about consent in relationships.
Without actually talking about sex, which is really cool.
Yeah. It sort of like models relationships in general and like becomes a tool that you can use to have those conversations like with kids or kids with themselves, like
or even honestly, like me as an adult human, like it's like, there are these moments I like hear and see these things. I'm like, oh, that's just like garment. You know?
I shouldn't fuse.
Don't fuse around.
Well, it's interesting. I think like the part that I know nothing about the show. This is the first time hearing about it. But the part that sticks out for me the most in that is that the only way it works is if they're both like making autonomous decisions that aren't being influenced by other people to engage in this thing. That's the only way that works. I'm like, what an awesome role model for sexual relationships.
That's a dope metaphor.
Yeah, that's super cool.
Yeah. Well, we are almost out of time, but I want to like make sure that you have some time for any final thoughts.
Oh, I was going to say that we've been talking a lot about, thank you for that, Catherine.
You're welcome.
We've been talking a lot about TV and movies and what sort of visual media we're consuming and how to be critical of that. But there's also a ton of print media out there. You know, if you're reading fiction books, look for the healthy or unhealthy relationships in those books and talk about it. I was just hanging out with a bunch of rad authors and librarians at the main reading roundup. So if any of you are tuning in, thanks for hanging out. I'll wave with this hand. But you know, this obviously focuses on visual media, and that's that's important for us to consume that. But what are we reading, and how are we interpreting what we read too?
Yeah.
I just want to say that like it's okay to just enjoy yourself, right?
Well,
like,
thanks for the comment.
Oh, and you angel. But yeah, if you just want to like Netflix and actually chill, that's fine too, right? Like not everything has to be this like great dissertation on what they're trying to say. But I think it is important to make sure that at least some of the time that you're consuming media, to make sure that you're asking those critical questions and trying to be a responsible consumer.
And you can ask us. Leave some comments below. Let us know what your faves are. I would love to see if people have comments about good sexual relationships or healthy sexuality sort of being portrayed in media. And you're going to do a blog post.
I'm going to do a blog post. We're going to take some of the awesome questions that you provided for our viewers and put them on a blog post so that like you can look at your favorite TV or movie piece and like utilize those to have a conversation about these things.
I kind of want to get together and watch a show and talk about it.
Yeah.
Live stream with the hot goslings.
Yeah, what show should we do?
Ooh, yeah. Goslings? What show should we do?
Post it below. All
right, love you. Bye.
Bye.
Oh, we'd never do it right.
No, I did right.